There is something that almost no one has the courage to admit, not even for themselves. And if you're here, there's a good chance you've felt it before. A silent discomfort, a strange pressure in the chest, a sense that the way you love, the way you give yourself, the way you exist, it was never totally yours. You tried to ignore it. He told himself that he was just a good person. What an understanding being, patient, available. It was simply who you were. But deep down, there has always been something out of place, because no matter how much you gave, no matter how hard you tried to be enough, there was always a void, something unresolved, something that pulled you back to the same standards, the same invisible tiredness, the same feeling of carrying more than you should. And here's the truth that most avoid their entire lives. It didn't start with the world. It didn't start with your relationships. It started much earlier, in a place you've never fully questioned because it seemed untouchable. But when an empath begins to see this, something inside him changes. Not explosively, not angry, not with confrontation, but in a much deeper way and much more definitive. Because from that moment on, you can't go back to who you were, and it is exactly here that freedom begins, the invisible image that shaped his way of loving. There is a part within you that has always known. I didn't know how to explain it. I didn't know how to name it, but I did. From a very early age, before you even understood what love was, before you even understood what choice was, something inside you began to adjust. It was not a conscious decision. It wasn't something you chose to be. It was something you became to maintain a connection. Because at the beginning of life, love is not just a feeling, it's survival. And at that invisible point, an image began to form within you. The image of the mother, not necessarily from the real person, but the way you felt it, the way you perceived his presence, his absence, his gaze, his silence, their unspoken expectations, and without realizing it, you started to mold yourself around that. Maybe you learned that you needed to be calm so as not to generate tension, or that it needed to be strong so as not to cause concern, or that she needed to be sensitive to keep the connection alive. And so, little by little, you were ceasing to be something spontaneous, to become something necessary. This is the point that almost no one realizes, because it doesn't feel like a loss. It feels like love. It seems careful. It feels like a connection. But over time, this image begins to become an internal structure, a silent reference that guides everything. The way you relate to each other, the way you give yourself, the way you feel guilty for choosing yourself. And the deepest is that you believe that this is you, but it is not. It is a construction, such an old adaptation, that mixed with his identity. And that's why this path is so rare, because when you start looking at that image, not as something sacred, but as something that shaped you, something inside you starts shaking, not because of rejection, but for recognition. You begin to realize that much of what you called love, it was, in fact, a silent attempt to keep something intact, something that could never be lost. And at that moment, you start to separate, not from your mother, but the internal image that kept you tied to a role. And this separation, it is the first step of freedom, but also it is the first step of what few can bear to go through. The empath who learned to exist for the other before, existing for himself. There is a type of person who has not learned to live, learned to feel first, feel the environment, feel the mood swings, feeling what was not said. While other people were figuring out who they were, you were figuring out how to keep everything in balance. Without realizing it, you have become someone who reads the world before you even enter it, someone who adjusts his presence before it was even noticed. And this did not come by force, it came out of necessity, because at some point, exist as you really were. It didn't seem safe. So you did what few can do in such a profound way. You have adapted emotionally. You have become the peacekeeper, that which avoided conflicts, that which sustained connections. And over time, this is no longer something you did and became who you were. But there is an invisible cost to this, because when you learn to exist for the other before you exist for yourself, you start to disappear without realizing it. Not dramatically, not in an obvious way, but in a subtle way. You start to doubt what you feel. He begins to prioritize what the other needs. You start ignoring what arises inside you, because there is always something more important outside. And this is the point that imprisons, not because someone arrests you, but because you become the maintainer of that standard. You keep giving, keep understanding. It continues to sustain, even when there is no turning back, even when something inside you asks for silence, space, distance. But you don't listen. Why listen to that? It means breaking something much deeper. It means getting out of the role that gave you identity for so long. And this is where the empath begins to feel something strange, a tiredness that is not physical, an internal distance, a feeling that something needs to change, but without knowing exactly what. This is the beginning of the rupture, because for the first time, you begin to realize that living like this, it is not freedom, it's repetition. And when that perception becomes clear, there is no going back, because you start to see, and see, it is what begins the end of the old version of who you were. The inner silence, where the truth begins to emerge. There is a moment in the life of those who feel too much, in which everything starts to slow down inside. Not because the world has changed, but because something inside you has stopped keeping up with the pace of before. That which once seemed natural, it starts to feel heavy. What you used to do without realizing it, now it requires effort, and little by little, a silence begins to emerge. It is not an external silence, it's internal, a strange space where quick answers disappear, where the will to adapt begins to fail, where the need to please, it no longer has the same strength. And in the beginning, this is scary, because you don't understand what's going on. You just realize that you can't be the same as before. The same situations, the same dynamics, the same people, but something in you doesn't respond in the same way. And it is in this space, in that silence, that something begins to emerge, a perception, not logical, not rational, but profoundly true. You start to feel like you've lived a big part of your life, responding to something that was never fully yours, as if there was an invisible script, guiding your choices, their reactions, their emotions. And now, this script begins to fail, and that creates a void, a space where you don't know exactly who it is, but he knows he can no longer be who he was. This is the point that few cross, because here there is no immediate clarity. There is no such thing as quick relief. There is only one transitional space, a space where the old identity begins to dissolve, but the new one has not yet formed, and this requires something rare. Remain, without running away, without filling, without going back to automatic, just stay. While something inside you reorganizes itself, it is in this silence that the truth begins to emerge. Not as an explosive revelation, but as an inevitable recognition. You begin to realize that what you have called love, it was often an attempt to maintain an adaptation-based connection, that what you called being strong, it was, in fact, a way of not getting lost within the other, and that what you called being you, it was just the version that managed to survive within a pattern. And when this perception sets in, There is no way not to see it anymore, and when you can't help but see, the change has already begun, even if it doesn't seem like it yet. The breaking of the identity that was never really yours after you see. There is no return. There is no way to go back to the previous version of yourself, because something essential has been revealed, and this revelation does not destroy violently. It dissolves gradually in silence. No ad, that which you believe to be your identity, begins to lose strength. Automatic reactions no longer happen in the same way. The internal justifications are no longer convincing. The roles you held start to look strange, and this generates a feeling that is difficult to explain because you're not lost, but it is also no longer fitted. It's like you're between two worlds, one you know, but that he can no longer inhabit, and another that has not yet fully revealed itself. And in this space, the old identity begins to break down, but not as something that was imposed, as something that no longer holds. You start to realize that you no longer have to respond in the same way, that he no longer needs to carry what he has always carried, that you no longer need to keep what was never really yours. And this realization brings something unexpected, a distancing, not of the people, but of the dynamics. You start to observe without getting involved in the same way. You start to feel it without absorbing it completely. It begins to exist without having to adjust all the time. And that changes everything, because for the first time, you're not reacting. You are present. But this process also brings a specific kind of loneliness, not the loneliness of lack, but the loneliness of transformation. Because you start to realize that few people are at that point. Few people saw what you began to see. Few people would sustain this kind of internal rupture without trying to go back. And that is why this path is silent. There is no applause, there is no recognition. There's just a growing sense of separation, of what you have been all your life. And at the same time, a subtle sense of freedom begins to emerge, still small, still unstable, but real. Because when the identity that wasn't yours starts to fall, something authentic begins to occupy this space, not as a new built version, but as something that has always been there, waiting. And this is the point at which transformation ceases to be theory and becomes irreversible. The symbolic death of the paper you held for so long. There is a time when you continue to be who you were becomes impossible, not because you decided to change, but because something inside you just doesn't accept it anymore. What was once automatic, now it requires an effort that you can no longer sustain. You try to act as before. Try to answer in kind. He tries to keep the same place in relationships, but something gets stuck, something doesn't fit, and little by little, a deep discomfort begins to grow. It's not guilt, it is not fear. It's a clear feeling that you're betraying something inside of yourself every time you try to go back to the old pattern. And this is where symbolic death begins, not as a visible event, not as a dramatic break, but as an internal disconnection. That which you have sustained for so long begins to lose meaning. The role of those who understand everything, the role of those who support everyone, the role of those who adjust to keep the peace. All this starts to fall, and the strangest thing is that you don't feel despair. You feel silence, a different silence, not empty, but profound, like something inside you is finally stopping, of trying to be what it never was. And along with this silence, an inevitable realization comes. You were never that, you just became that, to keep something that seemed essential. But now, this is no longer necessary, and when this understanding sets in, the old version of you begins to die, not in a painful way, but definitive. And with that, some things no longer make sense. Conversations that used to bind, they no longer arrest. Dynamics that used to pull you, they no longer reach you. Expectations that once guided you, they no longer have weight. And this may seem strange at first glance, because you start to move away, not by rejection but for lack of connection. What once defined you, it no longer represents you. And for the first time, you don't try to fill that space, you allow it to exist. And that's what makes this phase so rare, because most people, when it gets here, return. It goes back to the known. He goes back to the papers, back to the old identity, for safety. But who remains, crosses, and as I cross, discovers something that can no longer be undone, the birth of a new presence that no longer needs to be explained. After the dissolution, something begins to emerge, not as a reconstruction, not as a new planned release, but as a presence, silent, stable, whole. You don't wake up different from one day to the next, but you see that something has changed. The way you feel has changed. The way you observe has changed. The way you position yourself has changed. And most importantly, you don't need to explain anymore. Before, there was a constant need to be understood, to be validated, to show that you were good, that you were fair, that you were true. Now, that disappears. Not because of resistance, but because it is no longer necessary. You begin to exist without adjusting, without anticipating reactions, without calculating the impact of their presence, and that creates something new. A stability that does not depend on the other, a clarity that does not need to be defended, a way of being in the world that requires no effort to maintain, and this completely transforms the way you relate. You keep feeling it. He continues to notice. It continues to be profound, but it is no longer lost in this. You don't absorb it like you used to. It doesn't load like before. It does not dissolve within the other as before. There is a limit now, not tax, but natural. And this limit is what defines this new presence. You don't have to walk away from it all anymore. But it doesn't mix with everything either. You get to choose effortlessly, and this choice does not come from the mind. It comes from a deeper place, a place that was previously hidden by the need to maintain old standards. And this is where something rare happens. You begin to enjoy your own presence, not as an idea, but as a real experience. Being with you, it no longer weighs. It doesn't bother you anymore. It no longer creates a vacuum, and that changes everything, because when you no longer need the other to feel whole, the other is no longer a necessity, and it becomes just a choice. And this change, it is irreversible. You don't go back to seeking validation as before. He does not adapt as before. It doesn't get lost again as before, because now you exist in a way that no longer depends on anything external. And this, it is the beginning of true freedom, the silent freedom of those who finally became whole. There is a kind of freedom that doesn't make noise. It does not appear as an achievement. It is not accompanied by validation, and it doesn't need to be recognized by anyone. She simply happens, and when it happens, you notice. Not like an explosion, but as a state. Something has changed, definitively. You no longer feel the same urgency. He no longer feels the same need to be seen, to be accepted, to be understood. What once seemed essential, now it seems far away, almost irrelevant. And this does not come from coldness. It comes from completeness. You have not become someone closed. You have not become someone indifferent. You have become someone whole, and when that happens, the world changes places, not because he has changed, but because you no longer position yourself in the same way within it. You begin to realize that you don't have to run after anything anymore, nor of love, nor approval, nor of belonging, because what you were looking for outside, it is no longer missing inside. And this creates a feeling that is difficult to describe. A kind of peace that does not depend on circumstances. A kind of clarity that doesn't need to be confirmed. You just know. He knows when something resonates. He knows when something no longer belongs. Know when to stay and when to walk away. No conflict, effortlessly, no guilt. And maybe this is the rarest point of all. Why get this far? It required something that few can sustain. It required looking inside without running away. It required noticing patterns without clinging to them. He demanded to let parts of himself die. That seemed essential, but they weren't. And now, what remains? It's something that has never been built. It was never learned. It was never molded. It was always there, covert, waiting. And when it finally emerges, there is no doubt, there is no confusion, there is no going back. You no longer need to prove who you are. It no longer needs to sustain an identity. It no longer needs to adapt to exist. You just A. And that's exactly it. That makes this freedom so silent and at the same time so powerful. Because it doesn't depend on anything, and so it can no longer be taken away from you.